Hey, I'm Scummery, and I am convinced the timeline is broken if, and only if, Tales from the Pizzaplex is canon to the continuity of the FNAF games. Oh boy, this is going to get controversial fast. Don't worry, or do, I can't stop you. I do have evidence to back this up. Let's get into it. First off, I know that the Scholastic quote stating that the books are set in the world of the newest games is still applicable. I'll go into why I think that doesn't necessarily mean Tales has to be canon later. I want to drop the meat of this theory first. I would not have come up with this theory if it weren't for the brilliant theorist ID's fantasy. There's a tweet going over the surface level stuff by her, which is on screen right now. Basically, everything centers around how Edwin starts his company in the early 70s and how this creates problems. My opinions differ some from this thread. They more align with a follow-up thread made here, but this is a good starting point to work from. The first thing I want to point out is that Edwin is 64 in The Storyteller. If The Storyteller takes place in 2024 or 2025, like the majority of the community has been assuming, that makes the absolute oldest age he can be when he starts his company in the early 70s 15. The latest reasonable date that can be referred to as the early 70s is 1974. That's already extremely suspicious, but there's more. Take a look at this quote, too, from The Mimic. Edwin starts his business right out of school. Given that he is stated to be a college student earlier on, in this quote, he definitely starts his business while at least in college, and based on the wording, it seems like he starts it when he gets out of college. He has to start his company at 15 at the oldest, so he has to be at least in college at 15, and probably graduating college at 15. This isn't impossible, but especially since we get a similar mention for Mr. Burroughs in The Storyteller where it says he went to college at 13, I would have to assume they'd mention if Edwin went to college at a similar age. That's not all, either. There's a mention in this quote that Edwin and his wife Fiona get married as soon as they graduate. I found a little conflicting information online, but you need to be at the very least 15 to get married in Utah, the location of this story assumedly because all the other FNAF stories take place in Utah, and you'd need the permission of a judge. Once again, this is something that I feel like has to be touched on if it's the case in the story. If you're 16 or 17, you still need parental permission to marry someone in Utah, which I would also think would be mentioned, though I am less confident about that. Either way, what we have here is that Edwin graduates college and starts his business as he graduates, marrying his wife Fiona at this time. Edwin starts his business in the early 70s. If The Storyteller takes place in 2024, the earliest date possible in the game's timeline, for reasons I can explain in a comment if anyone's curious, Edwin can be at most 15 in 1974. He can't be born any earlier than 1959. Therefore, Edwin has to at least be in college and probably graduating it, starting a business, and going through complicated legal situations to get married, all at the age of 15 at the oldest in 1974. Please forgive me for saying this is, in my opinion, impossible.
Oh, did you think I was done? Nope, I have more. The current community assumption is that Edwin is 24 in The Mimic and 64 in The Storyteller. I'm not convinced. Here's why. We get Edwin's age as 24 twice in these books. Once in The Storyteller and once in The Mimic. The immediate reaction upon hearing that Edwin is 24 in The Mimic is to assume that he's 24 when the story takes place. However, I believe this scene is a flashback, and there are two reasons for it. In The Storyteller, we get a quote stating that his wife Fiona was alive when Edwin was 24. It's on screen now, so you can read it for yourself, but this, in my opinion, is very clearly stating that Edwin is 24 and Fiona is alive. That creates problems if Edwin is 24 in the Mimic, because Fiona is dead, and has been dead, for what can be assumed to be about 4 years, given David was supposed to start kindergarten soon, and she died in childbirth. Also, take a look at the full quote for when Edwin is mentioned to be 24 in the Mimic. To me, this looks like it is a flashback. It's a quote where he's referencing on his job that he loves, his wife that he adores, and in the next sentence he's talking in future tense about his upcoming child. Then we get the drop of his age. The entire prelude to this sentence with his age is about his current life and what's upcoming, and it makes sense for the mentioned age to apply to that prelude. In it, his wife Fiona is alive, with the child on the way. Besides, if it's not a flashback, we have a continuity error between two stories in two consecutive books that were designed to connect. While this theory does center around the existence of continuity errors with certain pieces put together in certain ways, I don't think there are actually any major continuity errors, and I definitely don't think there are any within Tales connecting to other Tales stories. Okay, so let's take a step back and think about the implications of this scene being a flashback. If this one scene, where his age of 24 is mentioned in the Mimic, is a flashback, that means with the roughly 4 years of age that David is assumed to be earlier when the events of the actual story take place, Edwin would be 28 or 29 by those events when accounting for how far along in pregnancy Fiona could be. Now, think about the cramped timeline we have with the storyteller again. We've just changed the 40-year gap between the Mimic and the storyteller to a 35 to 36-year gap. For the storyteller to stay in 2024, like above, the Mimic has to move to the late 1980s. I don't think this is impossible, but it does destroy current community consensus, which is that Mimics saw the MCI, which I'm not convinced by the evidence for, honestly, but that's for the comments. Still, we've solved none of the issues about Edwin's practically impossible marriage, college graduation, and start of his business. Okay, forget the games exist for a moment here. Without the games, there is no plot hole with the storyteller and the Mimic. Let me put together a timeline of important events which only incorporates the confirmed information we get from Tales, working off the dates given, which is really just the one. Edwin is born in 1952. By 1970, he's entering college around the typical age of 18. At some point in college, he gets a patent for a robotic vacuum cleaner. By the time he graduates in 1974, he starts a business with the first item he mass-produces and sells being that vacuum cleaner. He also marries Fiona around the time that he exits college. By 1976, Fiona is pregnant with David, she dies in childbirth, and the events of The Mimic end up taking place in March 1981, per the month of March we're given in the middle. There's a few other events to connect here. Edwin's company is bought out by Fazbear Enterprises a year and a half before the events of The Mimic, so around 1979. Side note, this is Fazbear Enterprises and not Fazbear Entertainment. I have no idea if this is relevant in any way, but it was interesting, so I figured I'd point it out. 5 years before the events of The Mimic, so 1976 again, Edwin acquires the factory, notably while Fiona is alive, along with the mansion. This all works well and connects. Buying the mansion, to me, seems like likely preparation for when their child comes along, but it's ultimately not all that important. Anyway, skip the better part of 3 decades later, a direct quotation from the book on screen now, so sometime late 2000s to early 2010s, and Edwin has forced Fazbear Enterprises to honor their buyout agreement. The storyteller takes place in 2016 or 2017, given Edwin is 64 in that story, and he was born in 1952. None of this, as far as I'm aware, contradicts anything in Tales, and it's a coherent and fairly satisfying narrative based on evidence from just the Tales books, actually just the storyteller and the Mimic. The problems come when you apply it to the games. It's pretty clear that FNAF 6 takes place in 2023, based on both FNAF 3 being seemingly 30 years after FNAF 1, so 2023, assuming FNAF 1 is 1993, but more on the HRY223 message, which has the numbers 223, implying the message was recorded in 2023. We also have problems with Fazbear Entertainment/Enterprises existing before 1983, given the game 1, it has coins implying that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was formed in 1983, and Freddy Fazbear is unlikely to be an important enough character to name the entire company after him before he has a restaurant named after him. Shoutouts to ID again for this point. It's not like Henry or William's last name is Fazbear, so it's not likely to be named after a person either. Quick note, the difference between entertainment and enterprises is irrelevant in this context, if it's even relevant at all. Basically, if you separate Tales' continuity and the continuity of the games, you have no continuity errors. However, if you try to merge them into one continuity, or at least the storyteller and the mimic into the game's continuity, you now have a pretty significant continuity error. Now, could this be one major continuity error? Maybe, but not only am I already hesitant to just accept continuity errors when there's a valid alternative explanation that doesn't create one, there's one other piece that tips me over the edge to this not being a continuity error. As far as I am aware, the early 70s date is the only time in the entirety of Tales from the Pizzaplex that a year or a decade is given. To me, that's a sign that it's important, and we should take a look at it. If it's not, that's, at least in my opinion, very poor writing. Maybe we'll get another date later on, but this is the first date we've gotten across the entire book series. It's not like there really was a reason to give the date of early 70s either. You could just as easily put in a quote somewhere that says the story itself takes place in the 80s, and we have none of the issues. Once again, I think it's a sign that this date is important and not something arbitrarily put in. Slight disclaimer, this evidence was collected by brute forcing Google Books when I didn't have any of the books bought, but a year/decade is never mentioned in the Reddit Discord live reads, and nobody has provided a counterpoint when I've asked if another year or decade is ever mentioned. I feel confident that this is the only time that a date is given. Lastly, let me go over the reason I think the set in the world of the newest games quote is not outright confirmation that Tales is canon, since I did say I'd do that at the beginning. This will be quicker since not the main focus, but I can go into more detail in the comments if anyone has questions. It comes down to how the quote is worded. The first time I remember thinking about the quote, my conclusion was that it was advertising the setting as being the same as the games, and my current conclusion is the same. Set in the world of the newest games is one sentence, and all it really says is it takes place in the world that the newest games take place in. Scott has a history of weird similar terminology surrounding the FNAF universe, and I believe this is just more of the same. Think back to his quotes around the time of the Silver Eyes' release. Sometimes a timeline gets so full that the only way to tell a real story is to have the story set in a different timeline, an alternate universe, a different location, or perhaps from a vantage point that isn't entirely what it appears to be. This directly implies that a different timeline can take place in the same universe given they're listed separately in that list of possibilities. I would say universe and world are synonyms here. We also get a later quote in Fazbear Frights, which has further timeline issues, especially if Tales is assumed to be canon to the games. I've never seen somebody say Stitchlight is canon to the games and Tales is not, stating it will be a collection of short horror stories that takes place in the FNAF universe, but later also stating some will be connected directly to the games and some not, which further supports different timelines of events taking place in the same universe. Also, this quote is used in advertising the books, and advertisements are by their nature somewhat unreliable. In my opinion, they're fine to use as supporting evidence for what you're claiming, but not as the piece of evidence that confirms what you're claiming is true. Look at the Funko statue for Vanessa and Vanny, where they both exist right next to each other. This is not a piece of evidence you should be using to claim that Vanessa and Vanny have to be different people because they show up in the same place. This is merchandise that shows the two characters in one place. Advertisements and merchandising is not rock-solid evidence. Oh boy, it's over. Don't forget to leave a comment if you have any questions, or to let me know why this theory is horrible, or to let me know how much of the Geneva Convention I violated with this video. If you stuck around this far, thank you. This is one of my first scripted videos, and definitely my first dive into a video anywhere remotely related to FNAF, so hopefully it wasn't awful. If I can improve on anything, feel free to let me know. Also feel free to like or subscribe. I just want this theory to get out to as many people as it can. See ya!